Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation on international strategies. International strategies are growth strategies, much like the ones that we've talked about in previous chapters, but these growth strategies have slightly different nuances because companies that are comfortable in their home country environments are moving into host countries with different environments, and getting to know those causes problems. Just the same, it also offers benefits, and so companies will internationalize for 6 reasons. They internationalize to find new markets. They go looking for efficiencies. They need to find the resources that they use to build their products, and they'll go looking for innovation so that they can make their products better. They'll also, as with every growth strategy, go international in an effort to exploit core competencies and spread risk. That is, of course, what every company does when it grows. So here in this map of IKEA and their locations, you can see already that they are going international for the reasons that we talked about. When you take a look at the map of the United States and the map of Australia, you can see that the places that they have located themselves are large cities. If you look up and down the East Coast and the West Coast, you're basically looking at the 95 corridor over here, and you're looking at the major cities in California over here. And obviously one of the reasons that they are doing that is because they are looking for larger markets. An additional reason is that they're looking for efficiencies, which you can also see over in China where they do a lot of their manufacturing. Basically, having a store in these locations allows them to capitalize on the fact that they're already building and or shipping in the US products to these locations. And so they jointly offer retail spaces in addition to the manufacturing spaces in China, and that allows them some of their efficiencies. They also offer large retail spaces, which is all IKEA has, in areas that are near to where they bring products into the US. Additionally, if you look over here at this line that stretches across Russia, you're looking at a large forest that IKEA moved their way into. And that forest is the major resource for most of what IKEA builds, which is built out of particle board. And so they go through a lot of wood. And essentially, as they started moving into Russia, they were looking for places where they could access those resources. The cluster that you see around Europe represents the innovation that IKEA uses. A better example, or perhaps a more familiar one for you, of going international for innovation is what everyone else does with Silicon Valley. If you're in the tech industry, regardless of where your home country is, you go to Silicon Valley in California to access the kinds of innovation that the technology industry is known for. That effect is called agglomeration. An agglomeration effect happens when there is one physical location where innovation can be found or where a resource can be found. In this case, the resource in Silicon Valley is people. And so you'll find then that industries will agglomerate around particular locations so that they can access those products that they need to make their business run better. Next, we start to look at how countries can internationalize. And there are a couple of different reasons why these growth strategies are more common for internationalization than we usually see, which we'll talk about right now. You have 2 choices. Your choice of entry mode basically comes down to a question of non-equity mode versus equity mode, which really means how much ownership do you have in the company that starts up in the international environment. So when you look all the way over to the left-hand side of the screen, you're looking at exporting, which is the ultimate non-equity mode. Essentially, anyone who can mail something is in the exporting business, is in an international business. And so all it takes to get into exporting by way of international audience is a stamp, essentially. It's a very quick process, but you have very little control over whether or not your package gets there or in what condition it arrives. And that can be a real problem if one of the places that you're internationalizing to is an environment in which they are more likely to go through your boxes, or your boxes are not going to get there, or they're not going to get there in a timely fashion. And all of those can be difficult for companies trying to make their way into international environments in a controlled kind of fashion, or even a profitable one. The second form of non-equity mode involves a partner, which is why you see strategic alliances within that dotted area. There are a lot of great reasons to move international by way of a partnership of some kind. And licensing or franchising allows you to move into an international environment without equity involved. And so you'll find that a lot of organizations like McDonald's or Cinnabon, they franchise out their product. And that allows them to find themselves a partner familiar with the host environment or the host country to usher in basically their introduction into that new environment. And so when they move international, franchising is great for them because at the central organization for Cinnabon, they don't have to know anything about the other environment. They can license their product or franchise out their product into that environment if they decide it's a good idea, but somebody else assumes most of the risk. The only real risk to the parent company at that point or to the franchisor is basically if the entry goes very poorly, then the franchisor assumes all of that risk. And it would be hard to move back into that environment if it went really, really badly. So they'll do a lot of investigation up front to make sure that franchising is a great idea, but they minimize their risk by having the franchisee take it on. In contrast, if you want to move international by way of an equity mode, then you're looking at something like a joint venture. And joint ventures are much more popular in international growth than they are in national growth or in the US because joint venture is often required by the host country. So India in particular requires that no external audience be a majority shareholder or a majority equity holder, I guess, in a company that operates inside their environment. So in other words, basically, you have to go into India by way of a joint venture because you need to find a familiar company in order to operate. So a good example of this is Starbucks. When they wanted to move international into India, they still wanted to maintain equity. They wanted to have ownership over their advance into the country, but India wouldn't let them just move into the country and start operating their business. So they went in by way of a partnership with Tata Motors, which, as it turns out, is Tata is a very large parent company, sort of like Berkshire Hathaway. They own a variety of different companies. And so Starbucks moves international by way of this company that has a lot of familiarity with the home country, but they do not want to allow Tata into their central business. And so a joint venture in which they make a separate child business really makes a lot of sense for both parent companies to still maintain equity over the child company in some ways, but keep the partner out of their central businesses. The single most equity you can own in a company is to go international by way of a greenfield. And a greenfield essentially means that a company moves into a space and builds it completely from the ground up. And IKEA does this every time they move international. IKEA will go into an environment, they will break ground, they often will be housed. Their address is 100 IKEA Boulevard because they even build the road that goes up to it, and they'll run all of the utilities that go out to it. So this allows them an enormous amount of control. When they internationalize, they maintain a lot of costs because every building that they build essentially looks exactly the same because they're allowed to go into, or because they always move into a green field venture in which they break ground and they build it the way that they want to see it. And so that allows them an enormous amount of control, but it also takes an incredible amount of time. And so those are examples of the kinds of international moves that you can make for growth strategies. So once a company has decided how to move international, they basically have three general strategies for competing internationally. And these strategies differ on the basis of the amount of global standardization or brand recognition that a company needs across every country it operates business in, and the extent to which they need something designed for the local environments in which they do business. So an example of that is the multi-domestic strategy, which we also call a think local, act local strategy, in which they are looking for a locally recognized brand, but also a product that is tailored to the local environment. So when you look at this refrigerator, you're looking at a pretty typical American fridge. You've got the water and the ice maker, you've got the side-by-side refrigerator and freezer, and the little Narnia door in to get the milk. So this is pretty well tailored to the American environment. In contrast, you have this fridge, which is designed for a Korean environment in which people shop for groceries more often and they have power concerns that mean that they can't use a refrigerator the same way that we use a refrigerator. So it has the built-in freezer section like your dorm refrigerators did because there's not as much frozen food, and they don't have as much storage capacity because they don't need it as much. This is an Indian refrigerator in which decals and decorations are very, very common, often sold with it, if not sold as additions to it afterwards. Because refrigerators are status symbols, they're often placed in much more public locations because people want you to know that they have a refrigerator. So all of these refrigerators are made by Samsung, as you can tell from the picture in the middle. But they have a think local, act local strategy, because you really don't buy a refrigerator on the basis of the brand name. You buy it on the basis of its ability to meet your needs. Even inside your single environment, even inside just America, you will shop for a refrigerator not because of who it was made by particularly, but because of whether it has side by side or fits into the space that you need or has water and ice in the door. And so Samsung has decided to maximize their act local strategy with this by making refrigerators that fit the local environment. And they don't prominently display their brand name on it anywhere on the refrigerator because you really don't need to know. The opposite of this would be a think global, act local strategy, which we call transnational. And a transnational strategy is one in which there is a need for brand recognition that's common across all environments and countries in which it operates, but local responsiveness, because otherwise you wouldn't buy the products. So obviously McDonald's is a good example of this. They can't sell beef in India, so they have a locally tailored menu, but they also have the McCurry, which is even a word they trademarked, because McDonald's and the Golden Arches and the McBurgers are some of the most globally recognized brands in the world. And so they need to have that kind of think global, act local strategy in order to make sure that you, when you travel to France or Japan, you know where to find the McDonald's. You know that when you look at McDonald's, you're going to get the same kind of experience, even if the menu is slightly different. The think global, act global strategy means that they are maximizing cost efficiencies by having a single strategy for operating in every environment in which they operate. And IKEA is a great example of this. They only package their products with a single sheet of instructions, no matter whether that product is a sofa or a desk or a throw pillow. They only have one single sheet of instructions in it. And the reason for this is because they do not need to print 1,000 sheets in every single different language for every country in which they operate, because they don't put any words on the page. They use the home country's word for the product, which means that you've learned to recognize a trivet as a flark, but you don't know what flark means. And it also means that you know how to put it together as well or as poorly as you ever know how to put IKEA furniture together, off of the basis of instructions that are basically in pictures. So you get a couple of numbers when it refers to how many of each part you're going to find in the case. But in general, you're putting it together by trying to translate these pictograms that they include with everything. They get a lot of benefits and efficiencies by not having to print multiple kinds and not caring where each item ends up. So they save money for themselves and create cost efficiencies that way with this think global, act global strategy. There are several risks and benefits of going international. Probably the biggest risk of going international is the liability of foreignness, which essentially just means the risk of being from somewhere else. A good example of this is Purdue Chicken. They ran with a slogan for a long time that it makes a tough man to make a tender chicken, which is, of course, an obvious cooking term, that you're making chicken that's flavorful and good to eat. When they went to Mexico, they used that same slogan, but they just apparently popped it into Bing Translate and then started printing up billboards and marketing materials everywhere. And it turns out that what they had actually written, once you back translated it, was something a little closer to, "It takes a hard man to make a chicken aroused," which is real close to what they meant, but not exactly the same thing. And this cost Purdue dearly. Not just in terms of the money that they lose in the marketing campaign, but also in terms of the expense that they suffer to their reputation by making this kind of mistake as they're moving into an environment. It takes a long time to recover from something like that. The opposite of this, or a difference from this, is another risk of going international that we call the obsolescing bargain, which basically means that a bargain or a negotiation that you make up front disappears about the time you're ready to operate business. And so a good example of this is Coke versus Pepsi. When Coke moved into India, they spent a lot of money to create a manufacturing plant and set up distribution lines. And when they were just getting ready to cut the ribbon and start operating business, some Indian officials showed up and said, "This is really fantastic. We're so thrilled that you're employing so many of our people, and this is a really nice looking facility. This is great. But before you can sell Coke in this country, you have to give us your recipe." And so, of course, Coke, because this had not been made clear to them up front, and Coke had no intention of giving them their recipe, Coke packed up all of their stuff and went home. That meant that Pepsi had a second mover advantage when they came in, and they gave them a recipe, although it was not the same recipe that you would find for Pepsi in the United States, and so they were not giving away one of their key resources. And now they own the vast majority of the market share of brown, sugary, bubbly drinks in India. And so the difference between the liability of foreignness and the obsolescing bargain is that the liability of foreignness is an accident or probably hubris caused by the focal company moving into a host environment. The obsolescing bargain is caused by the host environment changing the rules of the deal that was made in the beginning. The similarity is that it's very expensive either way. From the other side of things, one of the big benefits of internationalizing is what we call the asset of foreignness, which is obviously the opposite of the liability of foreignness. The asset of foreignness is the benefit that accrues to your company from being foreign. We also call this the country of origin effect. And it accrues to some pretty specific kinds of products, so much so that you probably already know them. So if you want to buy a really nice bottle of wine, you get one from Italy or from France. If you want good chocolate, you go to Switzerland or Belgium. You're probably not bringing home South Korean chocolate when you've made some kind of horrible mistake and forgotten an anniversary. If you want a great sports car, you're going with something that's Italian or German. Even if you're looking for a very fast sports car, you're probably starting to look at some of the Asian nations for that. Japanese cars are typically well known for that. That's a country of origin effect for them. Suits and shoes are usually Italian. Bourbon is a really good example of how the country of origin effect sometimes even applies to the word. Bourbon and Scotch and whiskey without an E are very similar products, but the name of the product, not just the brand name, the name of the product changes to reflect that country of origin effect. So whiskey with an E is typically made in Ireland, and whiskey without an E is typically made in Scotland. And so one of the reasons you see these two countries making that distinction between the products is so that when their audience takes a look just at the product name, they don't have to know the brand to know that they want to drink or that they are drinking a product from one of those two countries. And so that ends up being one of the major benefits of internationalizing, is capitalizing on an asset of foreignness. This has been a review of international strategies. Thank you for watching.